Imagine you are standing on the riverbank in Windsor, Ontario. Look south, and you will see the skyline of Detroit, Michigan, close enough that on a clear day you can make out individual buildings. Same river, same latitude, same Great Lakes water. Two cities that share a border crossing, a watershed, and over 2 centuries of intertwined history. But the economies on either side of that river have been compounding at very different rates, and the divergence shows up almost everywhere you look. When you rank all 10 Canadian provinces alongside all 50 American states by GDP per person adjusted for purchasing power, Ontario, Canada's largest and most productive provincial economy, lands somewhere around 48th out of 60. That is not a typo. Canada's economic engine sits near the bottom of the combined ladder, and most other Canadian provinces rank in the lower portion of that same list. If this were a one-time snapshot, you could explain it away, but the trend makes it harder to dismiss. The gap between Canadian and American living standards has been widening, not narrowing. This is not a story about one bad decision. It is not about corruption or incompetence or bad luck. One way to read this history is as three reinforcing traps, each one compounding on the last, each one making the next harder to escape. The first trap is about scale. The second is about branch plants. The third is about deep integration. Together, they suggest how two neighboring economies, sharing a continent and deeply integrated business communities, ended up on diverging compounding curves. To understand the first trap, go back to the very beginning of American industrial strategy. On December 5, 1791, Alexander Hamilton presented his Report on Manufactures to the United States Congress. Hamilton was still in his 30s. He was the country's first Treasury Secretary, and the nation he served was still overwhelmingly agrarian. Most Americans worked the land. The country imported the vast majority of its manufactured goods from Britain. By any measure, the United States in 1791 was an economic afterthought on the world stage. Hamilton wanted to change that. He argued that agriculture alone would never make a republic powerful, independent, or genuinely prosperous. The country needed to make things. It needed its own industrial base, and it needed a deliberate strategy to build one. His report laid out a systematic program: protective tariffs to shield young American industries from established European competitors, bounties and subsidies to encourage entrepreneurs to enter manufacturing, and investment in what Hamilton called internal improvements, the roads, canals, and infrastructure that would knit together a vast and scattered country into a single functioning market. Congress did not adopt the full program overnight, but the direction it charted proved prophetic. Over the following century, American tariffs climbed steadily. By 1910, the McKinley tariff pushed rates on dutiable imports to roughly 49%. American industry did not just shelter behind that wall, it grew, diversified, and scaled to a degree the world had never seen. Now, here's a structural advantage that often gets overlooked. Article 1, Section 10 of the United States Constitution states that no state shall, without the consent of Congress, lay any imposts or duties on imports or exports. That clause had an enormous practical consequence. A manufacturer in Massachusetts faced far fewer internal duty barriers than fragmented federations often did. The Constitution did not eliminate every form of interstate friction. States retained other regulatory powers, but it removed one of the most common barriers that fragmented markets elsewhere in the world. The combination was powerful. High external tariffs raised the cost of imported manufactures, giving domestic firms room to scale. Constitutional rules kept internal trade relatively open. The result was a compounding engine like nothing else on the planet at the time. A textile mill in New England could sell to customers in every state without navigating a patchwork of provincial tariff schedules. A steelmaker in Pittsburgh could supply railroads being built across an entire continent. Scale fed specialization. Specialization fed productivity gains. Productivity fed profits and reinvestment. Reinvestment fed more scale. Each turn of that cycle made American firms more competitive, more capital-rich, and more technologically capable than the last, and each turn widened the gap between the American industrial machine and the rest of the world. By 1913, the United States accounted for roughly a third of the world's industrial output. That was not an accident. It was compounding at work, operating inside a continental-scale internal market that had been deliberately constructed over the course of a century. Now, cross back over the river, because Canada had a very different starting position and a very different structure.
As the economist Harold Innis documented in his influential body of work, Canada's economy developed around a series of staple commodities: fur, fish, timber, wheat, minerals. Each staple shaped where people settled, what infrastructure got built, and which trade relationships mattered most. The fur trade connected Canada to European markets. The timber trade tied the St. Lawrence corridor to Britain. Wheat drove the settlement of the prairies. And each of these staples oriented the economy outward towards distant buyers rather than inward towards building a diversified domestic industrial base. But the geography that made Canada rich in resources also worked against building an integrated east-west economy. The Canadian Shield, that vast expanse of rock and boreal forest, separated the populated corridor along the St. Lawrence from the western interior. Moving goods east to west across that barrier was expensive. Moving them south into the adjacent American market was often far cheaper. Economic gravity in Canada pulled towards the United States, not towards other Canadian provinces. This is where the second trap begins. In 1879, Canada's federal government launched what became known as the National Policy. It was, in many ways, Canada's answer to Hamilton's playbook: raise tariffs, protect the domestic market, and let industry grow behind the wall. Weighted average tariff rates climbed from around 14% to roughly 21%. The ambition was genuine. Canada's leaders looked south, saw what protection had done for American industry, and wanted to replicate the formula on Canadian soil. The logic was straightforward. If Canadian firms had a protected home market, they would invest, hire, and scale up. Eventually, they would become competitive enough to stand on their own. The tariff would be a ladder, not a crutch. That is not quite what happened. The tariff wall did attract capital and create manufacturing employment, but the structure of that manufacturing was different from what Hamilton's original vision had produced in the United States. The Canadian market behind the wall was a fraction of the American one. Firms operating at Canadian scale could not achieve the same degree of specialization, the same productivity gains, the same reinvestment cycles that their American counterparts could. And the control over the most valuable parts of the value chain, the intellectual property, the strategic planning, the long horizon research, that tended to stay with the parent firm, which in most cases meant south of the border. Protection, one might argue, did not build independence. It created a particular kind of dependence. The factories were in Canada. Much of the compounding was not. This sets the stage for the third trap, which arrived when Canada tried to escape the first two. In 1965, the governments of Canada and the United States signed the Automotive Products Trade Agreement, better known as the Auto Pact. The agreement eliminated tariffs on vehicles and parts traded between the two countries and effectively integrated North American automobile production into a single cross-border system. Canadian auto plants were no longer confined to the small Canadian market. They could produce for the entire continent, and they did, with production volumes and efficiency gains that would have been impossible behind the old tariff wall. The Auto Pact was a template for what followed. The Canada-United States Free Trade Agreement of 1988 and then NAFTA in 1994 extended the principle across virtually the entire economy. Tariffs came down, regulations aligned where possible, supply chains wove back and forth across the border.
The integration was staggering in its depth. As of 2024, roughly 3/4 of Canada's goods exports go to a single destination, the United States. Integration delivered real, measurable gains. Canadian consumers benefited from lower prices and wider choice. Canadian workers gained access to jobs embedded in efficient, globally competitive supply chains. Cross-border logistics became some of the most streamlined on the planet. For decades, this looked like a success story, and in many ways it was. But integration also deepened a structural pattern that was already firmly in place. When a smaller economy integrates deeply with a much larger one, the larger economy tends to attract the functions that benefit most from concentration and agglomeration. Headquarters clusters, financial markets, technology platforms, research hubs. These are the activities where proximity to other similar activities generates outsized returns, where being in the center of the network matters. The smaller economy, meanwhile, tends to specialize further in what it already does competitively, which in Canada's case often meant resource extraction and midstream manufacturing. These are valuable activities that generate real output and real employment, but they do not tend to compound in the same way that intellectual property, platform economics, or high-end financial services do.
This is not an iron law. There are exceptions, and the degree varies by sector and by era. But the broad pattern has been persistent enough to leave its mark clearly visible in the data. So let us look at the scoreboard. Measured as GDP per hour worked, Canada's labor productivity has consistently lagged behind that of the United States. And OECD productivity statistics show the gap persisting over the period from the early 2000s through 2020. This is not a statistical artifact or measurement quirk. It reflects genuine differences in output per hour, differences tied to industry composition, capital intensity, and the location of high-value economic functions. The picture at the level of overall living standards tells a similar story. According to OECD GDP per capita data in purchasing power parity terms, the Canada-US gap was in the range of 10% in the early 1980s. Since then, that gap has grown substantially. The distance is not narrowing, it is compounding. And the long-range outlook does not suggest a reversal is coming. In their OECD economic policy paper on fiscal outlooks to 2060, Guillemette and Turner projected Canada near the bottom of advanced economies for long-run growth in GDP per capita. Not the bottom of the entire world, the bottom of its advanced economy peer group, the countries that Canada considers its natural comparators. 3 data points: productivity, living standards, long-range trajectory, all pointing in the same direction. This is what compounding path dependence looks like when it finally shows up on the scoreboard. It does not announce itself with a single dramatic crash or a front-page crisis. It's a slow, steady divergence that becomes unmistakable only when you step back far enough to see the full arc. Each year, the gap is small enough to wave away. Over a generation, it becomes the defining feature of the comparison. So what is the takeaway? It would be tempting to search for the single moment where Canada went wrong, the one policy mistake, the one leader who zigged when they should have zagged. But that framing misses the deeper story. Canada did not make one catastrophic error. It got locked into a compounding path where the starting conditions, the geography, the market size, the resource endowment shaped every subsequent decision, and where each decision narrowed the range of choices that followed. A smaller, more geographically fragmented market made it harder to build the kind of self-reinforcing scale engine that Hamilton's America achieved. That scale disadvantage made tariff protection more appealing. But protection in a small market attracted branch plants more readily than it nurtured homegrown champions. And those branch plants kept the highest value compounding functions elsewhere. When Canada eventually moved to escape the limits of protection through deep integration, the integration itself concentrated ownership, intellectual property, and strategic decision-making outside Canada's borders. Each trap reinforced the others. Scale disadvantage invited protection. Protection created branch plants. Branch plants made integration feel necessary. And integration, while delivering efficiency gains in the short run, made it harder to capture the long-run compounding that drives sustained prosperity over generations. Stand on that riverbank in Windsor one more time. The skyline across the water is not taller because Americans are inherently smarter or because Canadians are inherently less ambitious. It's different because 2 economies started from different positions, made choices shaped by those positions, and then compounded those choices across more than 200 years. The math of compounding does not shout, it does not make headlines, it does not lend itself to tidy political slogans or simple villain stories. It just quietly adds up, year after year after year, until one day you look across the river and the gap is too wide to wave away. And by then, the hardest part is not understanding what happened. The hardest part is figuring out how to change the equation before another generation of compounding makes the distance even wider.